Hi there, welcome back. Hope you all managed to grab a hot drink. Sorry we can't provide hot drinks and nice biscuits for you as we normally would at one of our events. But yeah, welcome back. We've got 3 speakers for you for the second half of the session. And welcome if you've joined us just for this second part. I'll just run over how this is going to work for those that are new and weren't here for the first part of the session. So we've got 2 functions for you to communicate with us. We've got chat function, so you can tell us about yourself if you want, or you can sort of give comments on some of the things that the speakers are saying. We've also got the opportunity for you to ask sort of technical questions as well if you're having any problems with Zoom. Then if you've got any questions, we encourage you to ask them. We just use the Q&A button. And then we will sort them out and decide which ones to put to our speakers. Unfortunately, we often don't get through all of them, but we'll do our best. And we'll also do our best to stick on time and finish it sort of on time for you at 12:30. So if you want to tweet along, we really encourage you to do that. The hashtag is Autistica Festival and our handle is @Autistica. Or it's really nice, even if you don't want to tweet, for you to kind of follow the chat that's going on and see who else is on the meeting. And yeah, basically, I think we're pretty much good to go, but just let us know if you have any questions, if anything doesn't make sense, and we can get the speakers to reiterate that. We will be recording all of our sessions from the Autistica Festival. So if you miss anything, don't worry, you'll be able to get that on YouTube a little bit after the event. So I won't chat much longer. We've got Anne Emerson, who's going to be talking Theorising School-Related Anxiety in Autistic Adolescents. So can you, Anne, can you turn on your camera so we can see your face? Great. Hi, Anne. Oh, no, we can't hear you. That's a bit of a problem. Okay. I think that was, she's going to go away and come back. So we'll give her a few moments. Never a dull moment on Zoom. There's always a technical difficulty.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Oh, thank goodness.
I can't start my video. It says you've stopped it.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to do that, but
okay,
let me just
try
you.
No.
Make co-host. There we go. I think if I make you co-host, you should have all the permissions to do what you want. Are you allowed to do that now?
There
we go. I can see your video.
I'm so sorry about that.
No problem.
I tested it, but it didn't work. Right.
Fantastic. And do you want to share your slides with us?
I do.
Fantastic.
So is that now visible?
That is perfect. Yeah, I will mute myself now and leave you to it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Autistica, for this opportunity. It's been a really excellent conference so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it as well. So I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Deborah Costley from the University of Nottingham, and I'm going to describe some research that we did which has led us to theorize. So the theorizing is coming at the end of this. So this is, I'm going to report on a piece of participatory research. And we had rather a large team, as you can see on the slide, of 10 researchers who are a mix of academic and people and autistic people who were recruited through various personal connections. And what we were really interested in was, quite broadly at the beginning, anxiety in autistic secondary school pupils. We were open to lots of ideas that might come from this project, and as you'll see, it evolved in a particular direction. Our autistic researchers were paid to be part of the the research team, which is why you see the pound sign on the table. We had several meetings with them that were very social occasions, where we shared pizza and other snacks, but the money that we were able to pay them through a grant from the university was quite important in really acknowledging their role in the team. And so what a lot of their role was about was ensuring that we asked meaningful questions. So we devised an interview schedule which included discussions of awareness of anxiety. So were all the participants aware that they did experience anxiety if they did, and how that made them feel, whether they could express to us the sorts of sensations and the sorts of thoughts that they experienced if they were anxious. And then very importantly, obviously, what helped them, what was done within the school, or what did they do themselves to support their anxiety. We approached a number of schools who had quite high numbers of autistic pupils. 2 schools agreed to participate, so in the end we interviewed 18 young people. And with our co-researchers, we developed a protocol for the interview. So having decided what we would ask, we wanted to really think about how we would ask the questions. So our questions were worded very carefully to be as clear as possible. We allowed for pupils to decide whether they wanted somebody they were familiar with in the room. In one school, this was agreed, and the SENCO was in the room for all of the interviews. We provided various kinds of fidget toys, which quite a lot of the participants did engage with as they talked to us. And we also had a traffic light system so that people could say whether they wanted a break or didn't want to answer a particular question. And that was used by a couple of the participants. So our data from our 18 interviews really fell within these 2 main themes. So what caused anxiety, as well as what allowed people to deal with it. So first of all, what kept coming up, I'm sure that none of what I'm going to report here will be very surprising to you, but other people's behaviour. And other people's behaviour was a lot about other pupils who were often described as rude or naughty, disruptive, and a lot of our interviewees were talking about how what other people did made it very difficult for them to do their work, that they were very distracting, and also directly led to anxiety because they weren't sure what people were going to do or how they were going to react with the autistic pupil. Another a lot of people also talked about fear of the unknown or fear of change. And one thing that I found particularly interesting was that even though we were interviewing secondary school pupils, some of whom had been at the school for some years, they looked back to the beginning of that transition into school and all of their anxieties about what school would be like, and would talk about that quite a lot as something that caused them anxiety. So even though they might have been there for years, they were still reflecting on that. And I think that's important to bear in mind when we get to the end of thinking about what schools could do. And again, quite obviously, in terms of sensory discomfort, this was something that almost everybody was talking about as being very difficult, very challenging, particularly noise and crowds. So how did people report coping with anxiety? They talked about a lot about their need to fit into the school, to not stand out. And so they seem to express a lot of self-awareness and masking behaviours in order that they could sort of fly under the radar and not be picked on, not have people address things directly at them. And that was both in terms of staff and pupils. They talked about the sort of support that they got from the school. One of the schools in particular seemed to offer a lot of support, more than perhaps the other one, or certainly that was the perceptions of the school. So people had timeout cards, they had access to rooms. It was accepted that they might not always be attending lessons that were timetabled. And so pupils were aware of calming techniques, of being able to go to somebody, being able to go to a space that would allow them to reduce their anxiety level for at least a while. And participants also talked a lot about the importance of their friends and their opportunities to be with their friends. And very often it sounded as if their friends were made up of other people who had access to some kind of special needs support, and very often people that they saw as being like themselves. So what we learned from this study, I wouldn't say anything that isn't already in the literature really. One thing that we were interested in is that all of the ages, so even the youngest secondary school pupils, could explain, could recognize anxiety. Some of them didn't seem very familiar with the term anxiety, but if we explained it, they could relate to that quite strongly. So the main things that we need to be aware of is that obviously not knowing what will happen next or what will happen soon leads to anxiety. I'm sure that's something that we can all relate to. And that other people, particularly in school environments, do a great many things that increase anxiety. Some of those are probably controllable, preventable, and others probably not. That this desire to fit in relates a lot to anxiety because students spend a lot of time worrying that they will do the wrong thing, that they will get into trouble, and that they won't really know why they got into trouble. And the ability to go to somebody that they trust or a place that they feel comfortable was understandably extremely important. So this is leading to the theorising aspect. In the literature, there's a great deal of connection between sensory discomfort and anxiety about change. And there is some debate about the order in which those occur. And one theory that we are exploring is that they are a circular relationship, that sensory discomfort increases anxiety, but anxiety increases sensory discomfort, and it's specifically anxiety about change. So what we want to really think about next is whether somebody's difficulty coping with uncertainty is related to their ability to predict. So we are theorizing that a disorder of prediction or a specific difficulty of prediction may be increasing intolerance of uncertainty, or as this is generally known in the literature. So in terms of implications for schools, we need to ensure greater stress on predictabilities. Schools seem to have an awareness of the need for this to a certain extent, but not to the extent that it really is required by a lot of pupils, and that's why I really highlighted the aspect of pupils moving into the transition to secondary school being potentially so traumatic. And I think schools could do a lot of things better in that preparation. But we also are really considering the need to teach prediction, because if that's going to be a factor in coping with uncertainty, I think that follows on quite nicely from some of the discussions in the session earlier about what we can specifically teach pupils to do. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm at my time.
You are absolutely spot on, Anne. That's great. Yeah, really interesting and great to see your participatory research methods and nice sort of accessible interview techniques. It's lovely to share. Fantastic. So next up is Ceri Ellis, who's going to be talking about a qualitative study on the social ecology of educational contexts that participated in the PACT-G trial. So do you want to share your screen with us, Ceri?
Hopefully you can all see that.
Yeah, fantastic.
There we go, is that better?
Yeah, that's great, full screen.
Great.
Lovely, thanks.
Lovely. So yeah, thank you very much to Autistica for the invitation to present. And this is a qualitative study on the social ecology of the educational context that participated in the PACT-G trial. So just to start off with then, with just a brief introduction to the PACT-G trial. So the PACT-G trial builds on a legacy of work from the team, which has shown positive long-term effects on communication in young children with autism. So the original trial focused on children aged between 2 and 5. The original trial worked with parents in a clinical setting with their speech and language therapist to deliver PACT with the parent, who would then use different strategies and different approaches to communicate with their child through play. So to oversimplify the intervention, the premise of the intervention is to give parents the tools to promote these skills. And what PACT-G aims to do differently to previous work is to extend the intervention, where therapists would work with parents in the home setting and educational professionals within the naturalistic learning context of school as well. So the therapist would go into both of these settings and work with an allocated adult, the parent, or an LSA, for example, to teach the strategies to them, who would then use the strategies with the child. So the PACT-G trial also aimed to develop the intervention further by seeing if there was a generalisation of the improvements in these sort of social communication skills that were seen previously. So this was a large randomised controlled trial design, and we worked with colleagues in London and Newcastle, as well as in the team in Manchester. And between January 2017 and December 2018, we recruited 248 children to the trial. And we obviously worked with their parents and their education settings as well. So we engaged with 177 education contexts across these sites. And we developed relationships with these education contexts. And in some schools, we had several children taking part in the trial. So just come on now to talk about the intervention environments. So these were split into 2 age groups. So children were either in the preschool context, so aged between 2 and 5, The majority attended a mainstream nursery in this age group, with some children also accessing a preschool in a mainstream primary school, and other children attended specialist settings, specifically in preschool age. And then for school-age children who are aged between 5 and 11, the majority of those children attended either a special school or a specialist autism school. And within these settings, the intervention partner that was allocated to work with the child in these contexts, the majority were learning support assistants, and these would either be working with the child on a one-to-one basis, on a daily basis, or they'd be an LSA allocated to supporting the class as a whole, and this was primarily the case in specialist settings. So in education settings specifically, the intervention looked something like this. So there would be 12 intervention sessions split over a 6-month period. And these would alternate between school visits where the therapist would go in to work with the member of staff, and telephone or Skype calls. And during this time as well as doing the intervention sessions, the LSA was asked to practice the strategies that they were learning on an ongoing basis, and make little videos of their practice sessions with the child as well. And these would be sent to the therapist, who would watch them and then build in feedback for the sessions together. Something unique in the trial was the homeschool conversation, which was a monthly structured visit where the therapist would sort of facilitate a conversation between the LSA who was doing the intervention in the school setting and with the parent who was doing the intervention in the home setting, which was a very similar structure to this. And they would have a discussion about how the strategies are going across the settings, and sort of that building that relationship on how things were going. So after this 6-month period, there was a maintenance phase where we'd ask staff to continue using these strategies and to also continue holding the homeschool conversation meetings with the parents. So in terms of experience of implementation of the strategies and the intervention, anecdotal experience was varied. So some questions that we were thinking about as we were going along were, what are the attitudes in schools that are a barrier to the facilitation of evidence-based interventions more broadly? How did PACT-G fit into the current model of UK practice in terms of what schools were doing already? And if there was a systematic attitude for sort of social value of practice over evidence-based practice. So we thought about doing a little study with a subgroup of the participants who took part in the wider trial. And our aims were to form an understanding of what's important for education contexts and what are their priorities. What value does evidence-based practice have in schools and other education contexts? And if there are any social barriers, are they systematic or are they top-down? And we wanted to find some evidence into what are the extraneous factors affecting implementation of different interventions. So this was a qualitative study using a phenomenological approach. We did some semi-structured interview questions which were designed to address knowledge, attitudes and beliefs towards educational priorities and practices, as well as views on interventions and barriers to implementation more generally. The approach applies questions based on themes of experience contextualization, so it captures the phenomenon and we probe for clarifications. And the interviews that we conducted were with both the learning support assistants who delivered the intervention and also with senior management staff. And the way that we designed the interview topics were into these broad categories. So we asked about the process of implementation in the settings, fidelity with regards to the extent to which the teaching assistant felt that they could adhere to the intended treatment model, dosage in terms of how were sessions delivered, in what format, if they managed face-to-face or Skype sessions, or if they managed to do all of the sessions allocated to them. Quality in terms of how well the teaching assistant felt they were delivering the intervention as well, which was really important to us. And if the teaching assistant felt like they were having an impact. We also wanted to know what was the sort of context-specific factors affecting implementation, which is quite a broad issue to try and pin down. But specifically, what role does management play in this? And also evaluating the feasibility of future implementation of PACT-G intervention in the context as well. So just to explore some of the findings that we explored, particularly to do with difficulties and barriers to begin with. So the organisation of support and training differed between education contexts, and this was to be expected. We had mainstream nurseries and specialist primary schools, so there's bound to be some variation. But for some schools, there was more of a built-in model of specialist training and support for staff. In particular, special schools had a very strong model of sort of specialist support. In particular, one had a team of speech and language therapists, which were from the NHS. So 2 speech therapists and a speech therapist assistant, who would work constantly with members of staff in the school and with children on an individual level as well, to deliver different interventions. This was in contrast to mainstream provision and nurseries, where specialist training was a lot less standardised, and often staff conducted their own research in supporting children with autism. In terms of training as well, it was also dependent on priorities. So nurseries may not have another child with autism in the context, so they might not invest in training all staff, and special school may need to prioritise training for other things, depending on the needs of the children. Resources available also differed between settings in terms of time that the LSA had. So some reported difficulties in having allocated individual time with the children that they were working with in order to practice strategies and to capture these videos that they were sending to the therapists. This was quite specific to specialist settings where the ratio of staff and students in a classroom is quite fixed. Some schools and nurseries were equipped with iPads, which really helped with the technological side of capturing and sending videos to therapists. Some settings weren't able to capture videos at all, which impacted on delivering the intervention. And other difficulties were around supporting the intervention in sort of delivery of intervention in school. So some learning support assistants felt unable to share their experience during the intervention period, which was something quite specific because this was a research trial. We did ask them not to share specific strategies around what they were doing with the children in case it would impact the intervention. Which was a shame, but senior leadership did see that participating in the research trial was a benefit, and it meant that they could sort of pick it up straight away. However, they may not uptake the intervention as a package otherwise, because it's obviously difficult to know about the integral parts of what's involved. In terms of process and fidelity, relationships was a really important theme, with staff highlighting the importance of building and maintaining relationships with parents to facilitate intervention. a lot of the education context had really strong foundations with parents anyway, but some learning support assistants were disappointed that they couldn't see the intervention through to the end. This was due to either the child moving school or moving classroom, possibly at the end of the school year. And staff really did identify the value of PACT-G strategies as well, with a staff member saying, "I don't think other interventions go quite as deep into like really looking and watching for signs of communication and things." So yeah, it's not really about other strategies not working. It's just that this is like sort of fine-tuning really, and really sorting, sort of looking at them through a magnifying glass. And in terms of fidelity and responsiveness, staff reported that they learnt about signs of communication that they hadn't thought about before. So I've learnt so much about the early signs of communication. I wish that there were more things like this available for us, as I really feel it's improved my work and knowledge. And also the positive impact that it's had going forward. So seeing positive changes. So one saying that I don't know if it was me noticing more or if it was Jay communicating with me more, but only after a short time I noticed this and we were tuned into each other in our time together, which was a lovely positive quote there. So I'll just end there. So thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions in just a while.
Thanks so much. Really great presentation, and yeah, brilliant to see such amazing feedback that you were getting, and good to hear that senior leadership were sort of bought in. It's just about getting the word out there, right? And that's what you're doing today, so that's really great. Thanks. So our next speaker is Jiedi Lei. Hi Jiedi, and she is going to be talking about evaluating how social anxiety, autistic traits and social network changes influence university transition outcomes amongst first year autistic students. So do you want to share your screen with us, Jiedi?
Yes, let me see. Right, can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's great. If you can go full screen. Yeah, wonderful.
That's good?
Yeah,
great. Okay, well, thank you again to Autistica for giving me the chance to present on some of the findings from my PhD studies, which is focusing on the topic of helping autistic students to transition to university. So I think before we get going, I think it's important for us to all recognise that the transition from school to university can be quite a tricky time for many young people. You know, we have to learn to live with people, you know, strangers that you might have never come across in your life. You have to socialise, navigate a really complex social scene at university compared to school. You really have to cope with, you know, conflicting demands that is brought on by academic life, day-to-day independent living, as well as socialising at university. And finally, you know, there are still other connections outside of the university realm which we need to maintain a close connection to. So people like your family, friends that you've had before university. So I think we can all agree that it's a very challenging time where students are trying to juggle lots of conflicting demands. So some of the work that we do here at the Centre for Applied Autism Research is thinking about how can we support autistic students to transition to university. So we've been running actually a residential summer school for the past 7 to 8 years, supporting autistic students aged 16 plus to come onto university campus, stay with us, get some first-hand insight into what university life is like, and make informed choices about selecting an institution, higher education institution to attend. So I won't go into too much depth about this this intervention, which actually I did present through Autistica last year as well, so you can go away and read a little bit more about that if you'd like. What I do want to highlight from this paper is some of the student voices we have gathered from the evaluation study from some of our past participants. So here is one student talking about, you know, having the opportunity to meet other autistic young people in very similar shoes who are all seeking to go to university, and that's really helpful to alleviate social anxiety about potentially not fitting in at the university. Also meeting people that they will be making that transition to university together, so knowing a familiar face at a brand new kind of university setting was really helpful as well. And for some other students, meeting people with social difficulties that's quite similar to themselves, again, and knowing that, you know, you can form very meaningful friendships despite having some social communication difficulties. And finally, it might be really exciting to think about making that transition and becoming more independent in university life, but it can also be quite an anxiety-provoking time for many of our students. So kind of thinking about what is the central tenet that's holding together a lot of these voices, I thought, you know, for many of our students is really thinking about how do I make a very successful social transition when I go to university. So again, thinking about making that social transition, again, I think it's important for us to question, well, to what extent is this really an autism-specific challenge? Because we know that adolescence really does mark a period of social reorientation where students are becoming much more independent, moving away from family, you know, making much more peer relationships compared to before, and putting greater weightings onto how peers might perceive themselves compared to kind of earlier childhood. And this coincides with the phase of heightened prevalence of social anxiety, which really is actually a shared vulnerability across both autistic young people as well as neurotypical students as well. Although we do know that amongst autistic individuals, there's a very high co-occurrence between autism and social anxiety. But more specifically in the context of autism, we know a large percentage of them experience feelings of loneliness at university, suggesting to us that the social connections they're making at university may not necessarily be meeting all of their social needs. And like Jade and Cara mentioned before, early on during the panel, you know, parents of many of our autistic children and young people play a really pivotal role throughout childhood, scaffolding social activities, helping them manage daily living. So really thinking about when these students make the transition from home to university, you know, to what extent can they actually develop a meaningful social network that will enable them to meet all of those different support needs, sometimes in the absence of having family and parents on hand? And is there a way that we can visually capture this to help us gain insight into students' social transition to university? So when I started thinking about this issue during my PhD, I thought, you know, it would be really nice if students have an online tool which they can access and just input some information about who they're interacting with on a regular basis and how they're accessing support through those social network. So this is a tool I developed known as the Social Network Analysis and Perceived Social Support, or the SNAPS tool. And here students are asked to really report on two different dimensions. So firstly, thinking about social network structure, students are really asked to think about, you know, can you think of up to 20 people who you consider to be quite important to you, that you have had contact with in the past 3 months? And what is your relationship to that individual? Are they a member of your family? Are they a friend, a member of university staff? And how tightly knit is your social group? So to what extent do you think these people that you have named are in contact or know of each other as well? The second dimension captured by the SNAPs is for every single network member the student has named, they're asked to think about, you know, to what extent did this person provide you with academic, daily living and social support during your time here at university? And if they do provide you with any of that support, what is your perceived quantity and quality of support provided by that individual as well? To give you a sense of what the SNAPs is able to capture, here is a transition map from one of our autistic students before they have made the transition to university. So from reflecting on their time at school. Here you can see every single circle here represents a network member within their social network. So someone the student considers very close to, that they have interacted with. And this is relatively small. So you can see the bigger the size of the circle, it means that that individual is more densely connected to other network members. So here you can see that for this particular student, mum and dad, a best friend from before university, as well as a boyfriend from before university were the really key members within that student's social network. Compare this to another one of our autistic students before they made the transition to university. Immediately, you can see that the social network structure is very different. It's much larger, much more complex. And you can see here on the left-hand side, there's a large cluster of family relationships. And on the right-hand side here is a large cluster of before university friendships they have established. But the most important person is right here in the center, the purple large circle, which is the before university romantic partner or the boyfriend. So this might actually be a very functional, very adaptive and supportive social network for that student before they transition to university. But you can imagine as they navigate that social, transition to a new environment, the romantic relationship may or may not stay. And if it doesn't stay, then on top of coping with all the stresses brought on by adapting to university life, the student also has to cope with losing a romantic partner, but also potential fragmentation between their family support network and their before university friendship support network. So I hope this illustrates to you that the SNAPS not only captures what the student's social transition or social network looks like in the moment, but also highlight inherent social vulnerabilities within that student's social network as well. So being equipped with the SNAPS tool, I was then really interested in taking more of a longitudinal approach and think about what are some of the changes that students face when they go through university. So the first research aim here really is to examine changes over time in the first year of university when you compare a group of autistic students to a group of neurotypical students, when thinking about are there changes in their social network structure in terms of who they're interacting with and how those people may know each other, but also how are they accessing support. So really, what is the quantity and quality of support students are able to receive through their social network as well. And secondly, I was interested in thinking about, well, how do these changes really influence university transition outcomes when you measure that at the end of first year of university? And is that really impacted by any measures that might affect students' social competency? So things like having social communication difficulties, perhaps reflected by having higher levels of autistic traits, as well as having higher levels of social anxiety over time. Would those factors also have a negative impact on students' transitional outcomes? So thinking about the study design, students completed online measures at the start of university, so around September time, end of semester 1, so Christmas, and also end of semester 2, so around Easter time. Data was gathered from 2 cohorts of students, first year university students in the UK in a STEM-based university. And we had a total of only 28 autistic students who have received a clinical diagnosis and have disclosed that diagnosis to University Disability Services, compared to a very much larger kind of sample of neurotypical students. And these students do not have any current acute or chronic mental or physical health conditions, as well as no specific learning difficulties. Just the timeline of the measures that students completed, you can see that they all completed the SNAPS at all 3 time points. This is very much to map the social network transitions across time. They also completed a social anxiety measure across time to see whether that is something that would fluctuate across first year of university. Students completed the autism quotient as a measure of autistic traits at baseline, so time 1, and also transitional outcomes were measured at times 2 and 3 to see whether any changes occurred by the end of semester 1 and 2. Quick summary of findings. So what we found was that students in both groups who had higher levels of social anxiety perceived greater distress when they were asked to think about different domains of university life. What's interesting to note here is that for the autistic students, the distress associated with social anxiety was not just unique to social distress, but also in academic and day-to-day living. So actually, they had much more pervasive distress across multiple domains of university life compared to their neurotypical peers. When thinking about some of the changes in social network structure and composition, what we found is that neurotypical students entered university at time 1 with a much larger social network, but they were actually able to prune that down over time. So by time 3, what we found is that students only maintained perhaps the closest social network members and the most meaningful connections to them. But actually, we didn't see any overall changes in structure for the autistic students, and both groups reported a relatively larger percentage of friends as a group within their social network as well. Thinking about support, so neurotypical students mostly turn to their friends and they access support in the form of day-to-day living support, whereas for autistic students, family and friends played an equally important role in providing both day-to-day living and also social support at university as well. And finally, when thinking about transitional outcomes, here again, so students who had higher levels of social anxiety across first year of university really had more negative transitional outcomes across multiple domains of university life. So this is ranging from academic transitional outcomes to having a sense of belonging at the institution, having an attachment to institution as well. For neurotypical students, those who've had higher levels of autistic traits, suggesting perhaps higher levels of social communication difficulties, also had a more negative impact on their social transitional outcomes as well. So to give you a sense of some of these social network maps across time, this is one neurotypical student. And at the point of entry, you can see that they had a very large cluster of before university friends, as well as mum and dad and a couple of family members, and also a few friends that they have made since university, perhaps roommates that they have come across. By Christmas time, here you can see that the group of friends they've made since university is much larger, much denser. They've made lots of new connections. Mum and dad's still there, and they've only maintained connection with a couple of best friends from before university. And by times 3, sorry, just moving the panel. By time 3, you can see that the social networks they've made since university is actually a bit smaller compared to time 2, but they have a few clusters of friends, and also mum and dad, as well as a before university best friend as well. This suggests that they are gaining greater social independence and pruning down that social network over time. So compare that to a autistic participant, again, just to say that this is highlighting individual differences, that's not necessarily reflecting the group changes as a whole. But this is one of our autistic students who, at the point of entry, you can see there's a very large cluster of family connections and a couple of fairly isolated but friends that they have made from before university. By Christmas time, actually that family cluster has actually expanded, and they have only made a couple of new connections. So one friend and one perhaps personal tutor they've encountered at university. And this is by Easter time. You can see that the family connections is still the most frequently contacted network circle, and that personal tutor has stayed with them. But actually, in terms of friendship, it's very much lacking for this particular individual. So again, suggesting that there are individual differences we have to take into account when thinking about some of the social network transitions as well. And just finally, to think about some of the limitations, well, sample size was especially small for our autistic students compared to neurotypical students. And this was a UK-based sample, a fairly kind of selective sample. Everybody went to university, in a fairly competitive university as well. So thinking about recruiting a more diverse, perhaps cross-cultural comparisons can increase the generalizability of the current study findings. But we have identified that social anxiety as really a key shared vulnerability for all of our students. And so perhaps for university stakeholders, it's important to think about how can we help these students plan for some of the social changes before they arrive on campus. Perhaps delivering workshops so students can better recognize and learn how to cope with social anxiety and know that this is something that's very normal. A lot of students experience that. But in the context of autism, sometimes it's quite easy for even clinicians to conflate symptoms from social anxiety with symptoms of social communication difficulties that's part of autism. So perhaps we need to think about training for our professional staff so that we can better learn to recognize the two sets of symptoms and support autistic students with their social anxiety symptoms. But thinking about social network as well, I think it's important to highlight that we need to facilitate better communication across multiple stakeholder groups to create a more integrated support system for students making that important transition from school to university. And also perhaps having clearer signposting for students so that they know who they can go to for what kinds of support. Again, that ties in with social anxiety. So perhaps if you knew who you can go to for what kinds of support, there's a very clear reason for why you're initiating social interaction with that individual. And that might alleviate some of that social anxiety as well. And finally, I think it's important to think about how can we support family members. We saw from the earlier slide, you know, they're equally important in terms of providing support, especially for autistic students. So how can we support them to know how they can effectively support our students during that transition period as well? I think that's a very important future direction to consider. And finally, just to thank our amazing team. So you've met Jade and Cara earlier on in the session, but just wanted to thank all of my supervisors and everybody here at the Centre for Applied Autism Research for bringing all of this work together as well. So thank you. That's everything I was going to say.
Thank you so much, Jiedi. So much information there. That was amazing. And yeah, it's got me thinking about my own sort of social networks, my own little maps in my head. They were fascinating. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to hear sort of your plans for your next steps for your research. Maybe we'll discuss that in the Q&A. So shall we invite all of our speakers back? Do you want to turn on your cameras and rejoin the room? Great. So first of all, it'd be really nice to hear a bit about your background. We did that in a session earlier today. So you know, how you got into your research area, you know, whether you had any sort of professional, personal experience of autism previously. So should we start with you, Anne?
Thanks. I started my career as a speech and language therapist. So I was working in a special school after some time with children which included autistic children, and various other roles where I worked with autistic adults as well, and that interest really led me into academia.
Fantastic. Ceri, do you want to tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. I originally did a degree in psychology and got really interested in all aspects of child development. And then I did my PhD in sort of linguistics, but then just really wanted to do something more applied, and was really lucky to get a postdoc position in the Social Development Research Group in Manchester, and I worked on PACT-G. And now I work on another project called Reach ASD with parents of autistic children as well. So
fantastic. And Jiedi?
Yeah, so I think quite similar to Ceri actually. So I became really fascinated with autism, but also developmental neuroscience during my undergrad. And so pursuing that during my master's studies, I worked a lot with autistic children doing kind of early behavioural interventions and play-based interventions. And quite often, you know, lots of the parents would ask me things like, you know, what you know, will my child be able to transition to university? What would it look like for them when they enter young adulthood? Because I think there's a lot more support for children compared to young people and also adults on the spectrum. So that really got me thinking about, okay, what kind of applied research can I do to support young people and children making those transitions? So I was very lucky to get into the Centre for Applied Autism Research and work on my PhD studies, but also support the autism summer school we run here as well.
Fantastic. Great. So a few sort of individual questions that have come in. First of all, question for you, Anne. It's sort of two questions. So did you find any differences between males and females? And were there any effects or differences which may be due to the SENCO being present in one setting?
Yes, thank you. We had 11 boys in our sample and 7 girls. We didn't really look at the data to look at gender differences. There were a couple of things that jumped out. So it seemed to be the boys who were particularly worried that they would somehow end up in trouble inadvertently. But it's a small sample, so that would need looking at. In regards to the effect of the SENCO, we didn't note that there was any influence. The SENCO was a physical presence, but she didn't really engage with the students during the process. But after the interviews, because all of the interviews in that batch talked about bullying, talked about having been bullied, she did comment that this was a common theme that came from the autistic students, and that when the staff investigated, they really felt that the students were not being bullied, but that they were misinterpreting typical school banter. And so that's something that we noted to maybe look at another day, because obviously we need to know whether students really are being bullied or whether they are misinterpreting, and that could potentially limit their anxiety if we could help them to see that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Now a question for you, Ceri. Do you think that having extra support in secondary school or college might make it even harder to transition to university or further education college, which might lack any types of support like that?
I think that's an interesting question, because I think in different, children's different ages and different settings, the support that they have in those different settings looks very different. So even sort of support and transition from primary to secondary looks, it is sort of, those two things are very different settings. So I think looking even further than that, going into sort of secondary and university, the levels of support really do need to change and need to be really sort of malleable in to sort of be able to address the needs of that sort of individual pupil as well, because these sort of structured interventions that we might be able to do in primary schools, the sort of needs and sort of support needed for children at the different stages, that sort of really does look very different, I think, as children grow older as well. So I think that's a difficult question to sort of address in a nugget, but I think it's just something that really has to be very organic and structured towards the sort of individual needs of that young person.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Interesting question here for you, Jiedi. Does the SNAPS tool map online relationships?
Yes, I saw that question coming in actually. So the SNAPS tool, we ask students to report up to 20 people that they consider to be close to them. We don't place any restrictions on who they can or cannot include. So we do ask questions for students to clarify how have you made contact with that individual in the past 3 months. So there are options for them to say, you know, all of that contact was perhaps via online or texting, you know, rather than having face-to-face interactions. So the data so there is scope for the SNAPS tool to look into that and break that down. I haven't, you know, explored that so far. So because of our sample sizes so far, we've only been looking at social networks, including everybody, both online and offline together. But there is the room within the SNAPS tool to explore kind of online versus offline social networks as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, we know that online relationships can be really valuable, especially at times of transition like that when they're moving away from home. Great. So I've got another question here. So someone's saying that they worked with students who were transitioning into university and said a number were reluctant to disclose their diagnosis because they wanted to basically start afresh. Is this something you experienced, and how would you encourage them to engage with supports and autistic classmates?
Yeah, this is something I'm very much aware of, and I think partly contributed to why the sample size for autistic students was much smaller, because of the reason that some people choose not to disclose for a variety of reasons. This is something that we touch upon actually during the Autism summer school program that we run for autistic students who are, you know, before they kind of make that transition. So those who are in sixth form and thinking about applying to, or, you know, hold conditional offers to go to university. And we run a session on diagnosis, and the purpose of that is for the university disability office to give them a chance to tell these students in person all the different types of support that is available to them on campus should they choose to disclose their diagnosis, and how they can do so in a way that's most beneficial to them in terms of accessing the supports that they can receive. I think there's a lot of doubts for these young people, because, you know, they might have chosen to disclose to certain people, you know, growing up, and they have encountered sometimes quite negative personal experiences. You know, we do run a workshop and some of our students tell us that, but so I think it's really important for stakeholders and school support staff to really highlight to the students, make it really explicit to them the benefits that they can get from disclosing. And it's not something that you need to tell everybody about. You know, you can very much choose to disclose to very few individuals, people who are able to navigate that support and make sure that you can access that support. So it is something that we kind of discuss with our students quite openly during the Autism summer school program. Yeah, just to make sure that, you know, it's totally up to them what they choose to do, but they can make the most informed decision when they're in that position as well.
Fantastic, that's great. And just going back to, we'll go back to Anne and Ceri, because I feel like you've said less. Do you want to just tell me about your sort of plans for next steps, or what you'd like to see happen next as a result of your work? I know that you both mentioned it briefly in your final slides, but Anne, do you just want to kind of reiterate?
Yeah, we're very interested in exploring prediction. We don't have any firm plans of how we're going to do that yet, other than reading the literature, and we have submitted a paper about this. There's so much within the research project we've just done that could be built on. So as I was saying about looking further at perceptions of bullying, we're very keen to work with schools to really increase their awareness of how they can make the day predictable, how they can keep students safe, feeling comfortable, but at the same time not ending up with students spending an awful lot of their time in a separate provision within an inclusive school, because we don't really see that as inclusive. Great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And same question to you, Ceri. Yeah, next steps and any sort of key takeaways for those that on the chat, sort of whether it's parents or whether it's sort of teachers, speech and language therapists?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So ideally, we really see this being sort of the uptake from parents. It's something that's being rolled out in different sort of NHS provision anyway, sort of PACT as a therapy for parents. However, for schools, I think it's a bit more of a challenge, and especially for different settings. Obviously, it needs sort of resource, time for training, and the cost involved in that. But also how the intervention model sort of fits in different settings. So for somewhere like a nursery where it's very much child-led and play-based, the intervention will fit in really well. However, in sort of a primary age special school, we're a bit more at odds with sort of targets that children have to meet with the language and communication, or if sort of schools are implementing other sort of structured interventions as well. So it just sort of, we're at that place now where we just sort of try to fit it in with sort of what practice already looks like, and just sort of moving on to the model where it fits in and sort of works in different settings, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all three of you. You've been great, and answered those questions brilliantly. And just to remind everyone that's watching, you can catch up, watch this again, take notes, whatever, in your own time. So we'll be putting this on our YouTube channel, so we'll share that with you all. Just to finally say, if you want to get involved in our research or hear about the latest research, some of the researchers that have spoken today will be updating us, and we'll be able to share some of that information on our Discover network. So please join. The link is in the chat. And if you found some of these sessions useful, we'd really encourage you to make a small donation just to help us keep going in these challenging times when charities are sort of getting funding cut, and obviously many of our donors are unable to donate at this time. So if you can, really appreciate it. But yeah, just to finally say thank you so much to all of our speakers today, to you three and the others that joined us earlier, if you're still on. And we hope to see you at the rest of the sessions for the conference. It's running until Friday, so plenty more to see. So see you then. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.